In July, we launched our programme of online talks by members of our school community, and they've proved hugely popular. Don't worry if you missed any of them, as they are all available to watch on our Latymer Foundation website. I was delighted when David very kindly agreed to launch our virtually speaking programme for the new academic year with a talk on Latymer's history, especially relevant as this year we celebrate 125 years of Latymer Upper School on King Street. And in just over 3 years' time, we will be celebrating 400 years of the Latymer Foundation itself. The Foundation is the charity which runs Latymer Upper School and the Prep, and which has been providing education for young people in West London since the 17th century. I'd also like to express how grateful we are for all the help and generosity of parents, colleagues, and alumni across our community, without whom this programme would not have been possible. Thanks to you too for joining us this evening. Many of you kindly chose to make a donation when registering for this event, and this has helped to raise over £700 for this year's bursaries appeal. This appeal is currently funding bursaries for 29 pupils at the upper school, and we hope to raise enough money this year to fund another 5 for entry next September. The bursaries appeal is a key part of our Inspiring Minds campaign, which has as its aim to raise enough money to fund bursaries for up to 1 in 4 of our students. We've seen significant growth in the numbers applying for bursaries over the past few years, and at the start of this term, just over 230 of our pupils are supported by bursaries funded by the Latymer Foundation. This year, 1 in 5 of our Year 7 are benefiting from a bursary, and another 19 bursary students have joined our sixth form. Thank you so much to all of you who support our campaign in any way. We truly appreciate it. It has been fantastic to see our pupils back on site this term and to welcome the next generation of Latymerians to our school. It's lovely to see many familiar faces with us tonight, but I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to the many new Latymer families who are joining us this evening. I look forward to meeting many of you in person when circumstances allow. Okay, so a few house rules and then we'll get started. We will put everyone on mute during the talk so you can all hear the presentation clearly. Please feel free to type your questions in the chat facility so David can review and answer as many of them as time allows at the end of his talk. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the head, David Goodhew, for a history of Latymer in 10 people.
Well, Amanda, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. This is going to go pretty fast, so I hope that's okay, but we've got a lot to get through. I just thought I'd unpack the title of the talk a little bit, because clearly the word history begs a question, which is, what do we mean by history? And as a classicist, it won't surprise you to hear that I'm guided very much by Herodotus on this, the father of history. And the word historia in Greek means his researches or his inquiries. And Herodotus's approach was simply to report what people told him and allow the reader to make their own judgment about where the truth lay, in contrast to Thucydides, who believed that he could synthesize all of the accounts he'd heard into an objective truth and present that to the reader as fact. I'm much more in the Herodotus camp than Thucydides, not least because I'm a huge fan of anecdotes. One of the great privileges of my job is I get to spend time talking to students, parents, and alumni about their snippets and observations of school life. And indeed, probably my favorite classical author is Aulus Gellius, author of the 20-volume Attic Nights, which is the world's largest compendium of classical anecdotes. I recommend it. So if I'm going for that kind of history, it means that I'm taking the view that total history, totally objective history that covers everything about the school, is completely impossible. Inevitably, any history is a selection. So the question is how to organize this. How do I fit 400 years into 40 minutes? And because I'm biased, I'm going to do it by headship, which seems a convenient way of grouping events. And the heads of school are very interesting. It's a bit like Doctor Who. They regenerate, and we're all different, but there are some things that have to be the same, otherwise it's not Doctor Who. And you'll see that there's a thread that runs through the heads of Latymer. So I'll try and draw that out. But there is a downside to what I'm going to do, and there's a big downside to the existing history of the school, the current one in print, which is that this history is his story. If you read the history of the school, there are only 2 women named. One of them is Mrs. Hall, who used to be the school secretary, and the other one is Mrs. Wiggins, who used to help run the prep school. That's it. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that all of the pupils at the school throughout its history were white. And in fact, that isn't the case. And for example, when I last spoke to Harpal Kumar, he was fondly recalling not only the strong Sikh community in the school during his time, but the fact that it was the only school he attended in London where he didn't experience any form of racism. So one of the bits of good news is that as we move towards 2024, we're actually putting together a new history of the school. And we think this will be a vast improvement. It will be more inclusive. There'll be a greater focus on themes, continuity, change, and the whole community, pupils, parents, staff, rather than just on chronology and important men. So we look forward to the publication of that. I'm also well aware that when we get to the 60s and 70s, there are people on this Zoom call who were at the school at the time and know it far better than I do. So we've got some primary sources available to us. So how do I sum up 400 years of history in 10 people? Well, it's very straightforward. What I'm going to do is cheat. And on that point, let us begin with number 1. Here we are. And it won't surprise you to hear that coming in at number 1 on our list is Edward Latymer, 1556 to 1626. And I pinched this picture from the Latymer Edmonton website because it's rather a good one. So Latymer was a lawyer. He was a clerk in the Court of Wards. He was the son of William of Freston. And Freston was the ancestral estates just outside Ipswich. And it's an interesting name, Freston. It's the name of the school's debating society, but it's also the name of a road, Freston Road, just opposite Latymer Road tube station. It's opposite Grenfell Tower. It's a road that runs under the Westway all the way along Latymer Road to Wood Lane. And this was part of Edward Latymer's land. It was part of his bequest that was put forward to fund the school. It's also, by sheer coincidence, where I grew up. I grew up in the tower block opposite Grenfell on Freston Road. So that's a sort of a weird link. But when Edward Latymer died in 1626, his will dated 1624, and that's why 2024 we date as the 400th anniversary of the foundation. He died in 1626, and his will established the foundation for 8 poor boys of Hammersmith. Interestingly, there's a parallel foundation in Edmonton where he also had some land and a house, and that was for 8 poor boys of Edmonton in North London. And that gives us, a bit like sliding doors, that gives us an insight into the history Latymer may have taken. And I'll explain a bit later on how Latymer Edmonton diverged from Latymer Hammersmith. Interestingly, his funeral was presided over by John Donne, who was the vicar of St Dunstan in the West, who famously said, "No man is an island." And in terms of Latymer's philanthropy and the effect of his foundation of the school, I think we can see that that's true. Sadly, Latymer's tomb in St Dunstan in the West was bombed during the war, so it's no longer able to be visited. So in 1627, the foundation school was established, and if you look on the side of our library building, you can see the foundation stone for that school. 8 poor boys, aged 7 to 13. Sadly, of the original 8, only 6 made it to the end of their school career. William Burton got the distinction of being the first pupil expelled from the school for truancy, and very sadly, John Finch died aged 11. But the other 6 made it, and I did once ask our archivist, Malcolm Smith, if he could trace their family trees forward to see the impact that had had. But unfortunately, a church fire meant that it was an impossible task. As at other moments in Latymer's history, I'm sorry to say that the original Latymer boys didn't have a great reputation for their behaviour, and this was reflected in the extremely high turnover of schoolmasters. But by the middle of the 17th century, about 1657, the boys had moved to a permanent schoolhouse at St Paul's Church in Hammersmith, And that's one of the reasons the school has such a strong link with St Paul's Church. The Vicar of St Paul's is an ex officio governor, and so a trustee of the charity, and our Founders' Day service is held there. Going forward a little bit, 1726, there were now 2 schoolrooms in St Paul's Church, one for the boys of the Latymer Foundation and one for the girls of the Female Charity School. And the Female Charity School later on became St Paul's. So it's interesting that those boys and girls were studying in rooms next door to each other, even as early as 1726. But by the 19th century, there was a real zeitgeist, a real move towards education for all, crystallized in the 1870 Education Act, which stipulated an elementary education for everyone, although incidentally it was only free to the poor. The 1880 Act made attendance at school compulsory, and by 1891, fees had been abolished. And so throughout the 19th century, numbers at the Latymer Foundation School grow really quite rapidly. In 1817, there were 50 boys, by 1870, 125, by 1882, 200, and by 1889, 400. And so it's unsurprising that the trustees of the charity requested the Charity Commission permission to build a new school in 1860, and that school opened in 1863. But alongside the foundation school, there was a plan to open a day school for girls and also an upper school, Latymer Upper School, for 150 boys. And the intention was that 10% of those pupils would be there on scholarships. And in 1885, an opportunity came along. The Godolphin School for Boys on Iffley Road was in some financial dire straits and was interested in effectively being taken over by the Latymer Foundation. Indeed, there was some pressure on the foundation to create a girls' school rather than Latymer Upper School for boys. Interestingly, the trustees decided that they wanted to site Latymer Upper School on King Street, a site which the Charity Commission really advised them against and said, it's very narrow, it's very cramped. Are you sure you don't want to go to this lovely Iffley Road site over here? And you know, I'm a huge fan of the governors of the school throughout history. I think they've been on the right side of most of the calls. But I do wonder about this one, because actually, if you read the history of the school's perennially short of space and constantly trying to find inventive solutions to a cramped site. And I personally wonder what would have happened if the governors had said in 1885, yeah, you're absolutely right. Let's take over the Godolphin School for Boys and move there. I suspect our rowing wouldn't have been as strong, but equally we wouldn't have had the A4 through the middle of the school. Even by the 1890s, the school was complaining about insufficient bike storage. And if I can tell you that last week we were complaining about insufficient bike storage, you can see that not much has changed. Incidentally, in 1904, the Godolphin School for Boys was bailed out by the foundation and became Godolphin and Latymer School for Girls. That's something I enjoy reminding the headmistress of on a regular basis. So, number 1, Edward Latymer. Then number 2, this gentleman, and some of you may know who this is. The face, this head here, you probably recognize from a bust that's outside my door. So this is the first head of Latymer Upper School, the Reverend C.J. Tubby Smith. He was the first head. Interestingly, he had attended Latymer Foundation School for a year as a boy. Why he was only there for a year, I don't know, but I think I'm right in saying he's the only head of the school who can claim to be an old Latymerian. And the early reputation for Latymer was strong right from the start, a very strong academic reputation, especially in science. And that's quite interesting for reasons we'll see later on. It had purpose-built labs right from the start and a really impressive track record in Cambridge scholarships. So much so that actually Smith received complaints from fellow heads who were quoted as saying, you can't expect to walk off with 75% of the firsts in the Cambridge Tripos. So the school's academic reputation, particularly in Cambridge, particularly in science, was always strong from the beginning. I don't know if this was connected with an interesting form of performance-related pay. The governors would reward the boys who achieved excellent results at school with a sovereign. Of course, you know, today we see parents who reward their children for strong GCSE and A-level results, but maybe that's something for the governors to consider. And the early pupils were an interesting bunch. In 1903, this gentleman left school, and he's one of my favorite quirky alumni. His name was Will Hines, And he was a member of the Fraser Hines jewelry family, but he was also a very keen actor. And so he took a stage name named after Hammersmith. So his stage name was Will Hammer, and he later on moved out to Bray and established the film studios, the Hammer Horror Film Studios. And for me, there's something quite apt about that early drama link to Latymer, and Hammer Horror in particular really seems to suit us. 1905 saw the purchase of Wood Lane, the school's sports ground, and football was the main school sport right from the beginning. Again, we'll talk later on about when rugby came in. The school register in 1906 tantalizingly records one pupil called Fred Goodhew, and I haven't been able to work out whether or not we're related, but his father ran the Lord Raglan pub in Hammersmith, which I think is where Marks and Spencer's is now on King Street. In 1908, an appointment was made for a teacher of English and modern foreign languages, and this was Reverend Dr. Dale. And he's relevant for two reasons. Firstly, he later became head of the school, 1921 to 37, during which time, incidentally, he introduced the house system, something that Latimerians are always telling me is very un-Latimer and would never work. Well, actually, it was introduced in the 1920s. But he was also mocked because of his northern accent. And again, that's something we might return to a bit later on. In 1911, Reverend Walsh, who was the vicar of St. Paul's, invented the school's infamous motto. And those of you who haven't come across the school's motto, Paulatim ergo certe, it is the worst school motto in history. It means slowly, therefore surely. Nothing could be less Latymer. Latymer is a buzzy, dynamic place, goes at 100 miles an hour. But the reason for it is that it's a pun on Latymer's name. So the word Latymer occurs in the middle. But I'm really pleased that we don't use that anymore because it doesn't really suit us very well. Most heads that I'm going to look at have had to face very serious challenges in their time. And interestingly, when I reflect on the challenge we've recently had to cope with in terms of the pandemic, I thank my lucky stars that I didn't have to deal with some of the things that Smith and some of his successors dealt with. Smith obviously had to deal with the impact of the First World War. 216 old Latimerians died in that war, including, very sadly, Smith's own son. So it's a good kind of perspective moment for me, really. So number 2, C.J. Tubby Smith. In at number 3 is this gentleman, and this is an early picture of him, but actually the one that he's better known by, which again can be seen in the main hall of the school, is this one. And this portrait was by Ruskin Spear, a famous local artist. Interestingly, his son Roger played devices in the Bonzo Dog Doodah band, for those of you who are connoisseurs of that musical genre. And Wilkie, as he was known, Fred Wilkinson Wilkie, was head 1937 to 1957. He was a grammar school boy, and you're going to notice a theme about that. He was a grammar school boy who was then educated at Cambridge. And again, he had to deal with a number of significant challenges, not least of which, of course, was the Second World War, 119 old Latimerian deaths, and the evacuation of the school to Slough, but also a political threat, and actually political threats to the independent sector are not new. And in 1944, the Education Act that was passed essentially required schools to decide between 4 options: becoming an independent school, a private fee-paying school, a direct grant grammar school, a voluntary aided grammar school, or a maintained school. And the governors debated this, and interestingly, the governors at Latymer Edmonton debated it and came to different decisions. The Latymer Foundation Hammersmith governors were very opposed to the idea of being an independent school. They didn't like the idea of fees. They felt it would make the school exclusive, less diverse. They were worried about voluntary aided status because it might give the local authority too much control over the school and its admissions. And so they went for direct grant grammar status. And what that meant was the school received a capitation grant from government for the number of pupils in the school. And in addition, the pupils themselves were funded by local county council scholarships. The condition was to be a direct grant grammar school that 25%, i.e. 1 in 4 of the students at the school had to be in receipt of financial aid. And of course, that's our target for our 2024 Inspiring Minds campaign. So symbolically, we will have become a direct grant grammar school again. Latymer Edmonton went voluntary aided grammar school, and is today a state grammar school, whereas you'll see later on, for various reasons, we needed to become an independent school. So you can see that sliding doors moment where we could have gone a different way depending on the decision. But we, and to be honest, in common with lots of schools that are now independent schools, chose direct grant grammar status. Lots of things that we think of as kind of integral to Latymer originated, in Wilkinson's time, particularly things like Activities Week, the Parents' Guild. I met Anthony Thompson, who was the boy who asked Wilkie if the school could play rugby, and he said they could. And in 1951, the school acquired Rivercourt House with a prep of 50 boys under the care of Mr. and Mrs. Wiggins. Interestingly, Latymerians aren't always very fond of their heads, and there's lots of criticism of heads who are too strict, too austere, too exams focused, and that certainly those things were said of Dale and others. Wilkie seems to have the opposite problem. He was very warm, perhaps almost too gentle, but really regarded, so far as I can see from everyone I've spoken to, with huge affection and admiration. One example an alumnus gave me, this was a young man who had fallen out with his father, and his father rather vindictively decided to punish him and said, okay, you've got this place at Cambridge, but you need me to sign your grant application form. And if I don't sign your grant application form, you can't go. So I'm not going to sign it because I'm going to spite you. And the boy went to see Wilkie and explained the situation. And Wilkinson paid for his first year at Cambridge, because once you were a first year undergraduate, you were then entitled, you were over 18, you were entitled to sign your own grant applications. And that's something that stayed with him. And he was really happy to share that with me. Where anecdotes are really useful is sometimes in proving the history of the school wrong. If you read the history of the school, there's a concern that Wilkinson's assemblies used to overrun, which apparently is the case, and that this used to annoy the teachers because they were keen to crack on with teaching. I'm afraid that may not be true. I spoke to an alumnus who lives in Mauritius, who explained to me that actually what tended to happen was, because the teachers knew Wilkinson's assemblies were going to overrun, they would time their arrival in the school for some way halfway through period one, and it was the prefects who did registration. Unfortunately, on one occasion, the prefects had smuggled a keg of beer into the prefects' common room, which they were planning to consume for some reason. The masters got wind of it and confiscated their keg of beer, at which point the prefects went on strike and refused to do registration. This led to a standoff that the next head, Ken Sutcliffe, had to resolve. And essentially the masters were very keen for him to resolve it, because without the prefects to do the registration, they'd have to be in school at least an hour earlier. But the other thing that happened at this time, which is really significant, is the formation of the Johannæum Society. So Wilkinson's experience of the First World War stayed with him. His life had been saved by a German infantryman, and he was a committed European. So after the Second World War, he wanted to reach out the hand of friendship to Germany, a very bold and controversial move at the time, required Home Office permission. But the Johannæum Society was formed in 1947, and in 1948, the first exchange party came from Hamburg. Tremendous school, the Johannæum, great tradition in classics, incredible music masters like Telemann and C.P.E. Bach. And that's an exchange that still goes today. We think it's the longest running exchange in the world, actually. But one of the people who went on that first exchange was somebody called Walter Grauberg. And Wally Grauberg had come to the school as a refugee from fascist Italy. He'd been admitted to the school by Wilkie and given a free place, and had excelled in languages, studied languages at university, and came back to teach at the school. And he went on the first exchange when the Latymer boys went back over there. And I met Wally actually in my first year as head. And I'm pleased that I did, not least because very sadly he passed away shortly later on that year. But I met him in Nottingham where he lived. And he told me a story that isn't written anywhere in the history of the school, but is so meaningful, which is that one of those Latymer boys who went on the first exchange very sadly got news that his parents had died and he was effectively orphaned. And on the spot, his Hamburg family adopted him, and he grew up with them, and they looked after him. And that's a real testament to the power of that exchange and the power of that friendship. So number 3, Fred Wilkinson, Wilkie. So number 4, Richard Perham, who was at the school at the time. And if you look at this portrait of Richard Perham, Master of St. John's College, Cambridge, Professor of Biochemistry, you might make certain assumptions about his life and his background. But if I tell you that Richard Perham's father worked for London Underground, his mother collected tickets at the Odeon Cinema in Kensington, and he attended Latymer on a free place. At that time at school, he loved science, he loved languages, he loved rowing. Indeed, he introduced a women's boat club when he became master of his Cambridge College. But he was the first member of his family to go to university, a bit like me. He became chair of governors in 2005, president of our 1624 Legacy Society, and his legacy benefits current students. And I've met the scholars that are endowed in his name, and they're incredible people who would make him proud. So his portrait is one we moved from the hall actually to the entrance of the school, because we think he exemplifies so many things about Latymer that are great. So, number 5. Number 5 is Ken Sutcliffe, 1957 to 71. Again, a grammar school boy, again educated at Cambridge. He was at Manchester Grammar, where Colin Diggory used to teach. Not then, obviously, but later on. One thing about Ken Sutcliffe that I only found out at a Latymer dinner is that he has a very famous nephew. When you sort of know who it is, you can see the resemblance. So there's Ken Sutcliffe on the left, and his very famous nephew is, because Ken Sutcliffe was from Bolton, was actually Ian McKellen. In fact, funnily enough, the pictures of Ian McKellen that look most like Ken Sutcliffe are in his scary role as Magneto. But I didn't want to put those in. Which is interesting, and actually in his recent nationwide tour, Ian's been talking about Uncle Ken, who was the headmaster. So that's Ken Sutcliffe. But it's fair to say that he had a sort of bumpy ride in the school. And I come back to Latymerians aren't always hugely fond of their heads. And I think Wilkie was clearly a very difficult act to follow. And people, yeah, I mean, it was very unfortunate. Around the school, you would see the initials GKO, get Ken out, or KMG, Ken must go. And people took exception to his northern accent and the fact that assemblies often began with the phrase, "It has come to my notice that certain boys have been misbehaving. It must stop. It cannot continue." But interestingly, when I speak to individual alumni, they say behind that, there were incredible moments of individual kindness from Ken. Bishop Ed Condry remembers Ken being a character reference for him when he was arrested for protesting against the Springboks during apartheid. And it was Ken who came to his rescue and testified on his behalf. So actually, when I speak to individuals, they say there was more to him than that sort of stereotype and caricature. But actually, I have to give him credit for a number of things, not least in 1961, he pointed out to the governors that the games facilities at the school, especially the playing fields, were inadequate for the needs of the school. And I'm pleased to say we reached the same conclusion a mere 58 years later. That's one of the reasons you'll be aware that the governors have given us permission to explore the Duke's Meadow development. Other things expanded on his watch, rowing. I mean, this was the time of Alan Watson, old Latymerian, incredible rowing coach. And indeed, his crew told me that the way they got Ken to agree to the boathouse was to name the first boat Mrs. Sutcliffe and then enter it in as many competitions that they knew they would win as possible. And then that would allow him to support the construction of the boathouse, which he did. The other thing that's interesting at that time is there was serious discussion about whether to move the school or to go through a phased program of building improvements. And in the end, the decision was to go through the phased program of building improvements. And that's, again, that's a theme that we'll keep coming back to. Okay, so I said I would cheat, and the next slide enables me to cheat quite significantly. So key person number 6 is the reeve of the Guild. So the Guild was actually founded under Reverend Dr. Dale in 1922 and consisted of a Friday evening activity of debate or a play or a speech or a musical item or recital, and then an end of Christmas term jamtaculum, which were very enjoyable occasions for everybody. And the Guild was largely student-led, and it brought together incredible actors like Mel Smith and Alan Rickman, but also people who wanted to get involved in the technical side, the sound, the lighting, etc. And it was an incredible society of students and teachers. And there was a real sort of mutual respect and friendship And interestingly, at the time, particularly in the 60s and 70s, the relationship between masters and boys at schools was quite turbulent throughout the UK. But Latymer didn't seem to experience that. And I wonder if that's because of the camaraderie of the guild. But there were some key figures who were the reeve, who was effectively the supervisor. I mean, the top person in the guild was the custos, which is always the head, but the reeve was otherwise effectively the master in charge. And there were people such as Wilf Sharp, who taught English. For some reason, Wilf's nickname was Toffee. I think Jim Smith's here this evening. Jim might know why Wilf Sharp's nickname was Toffee. Fred Mayo, who taught maths and physics. And most famously, Colin Turner. And Colin Turner was an inspirational head of middle school in English, and a real inspiration, for example, to Mel Smith in particular. So the reeve of the guild, very important. The guild, I think, is a key aspect of the history of the school. And this brings me into person number 7. We're doing well for time, who is Maurice Isaac. And Maurice Isaac, 1971 to 1988, was, you guessed it, a grammar school boy who went to Cambridge. And Maurice and I have a number of connections. Firstly, we both taught at Bristol Grammar School. Maurice, actually, even when I was at Bristol Grammar School teaching, was remembered as an incredible history teacher. And I was there as head of classics. But actually, the year I was born is when Maurice started at Latymer as head. I was born in the hospital overlooking Wormwood Scrubs Prison and Latymer's playing fields at Wood Lane, and you can work out which looked more inviting. I can tell you the answer later. Maurice came in 1971 and again faced challenges, namely in 1976, the abolition of the direct grant grammar status, thanks to Shirley Williams, who through a cruel stroke of irony decided to send her daughter Zoe to Godolphin and Latymer School not long afterwards. But in 1981, the assisted placer scheme was brought in, which again, Maurice enthusiastically adopted and was very important for the school in terms of remaining open to people from all backgrounds. The other thing Maurice and I have in common is that he oversaw the construction of a new sports hall and swimming pool, and he has my enormous sympathy for that. That's 2 years in my life. Another thing that's interesting about the history of the school here, where it sort of is a little bit naive, it talks about the school's Tiddlywink Society. And I'm afraid, and there are people on this call who know what I'm going to say, the Tiddlywink Society was a sort of a joke amongst the boys. Essentially, people would get up in assembly and read out the sports results. And there were students, and I think Tony Brennan was an example, who gave the Tiddlywinks report simply because it gave them the opportunity to use the word winker as often as possible in front of the head and in front of the school. So again, I think the history of the school's been a little bit naive and missing the point about why the Tiddlywinks report was so central. But the 60s and 70s in general were an incredible time for inspirational and legendary teachers at the school, the likes of Graham Behrman and Robert Orme. Future head Peter Winter started at the school in the 70s. Jim Clark, an incredible rowing coach who coached Andy Holmes, the Olympic champion. Chris Hammond, and I think Chris is here this evening, which is great. But I particularly like to single out George Terry. George was a very interesting character. He had come to the school himself, so he's class of 1943. He'd had to leave the school to serve in the war, so he didn't get to go to university. He returned to the school as the school's accountant, and then in 1948 became the school's secretary, taking over from Mrs. Hall. And from 1948 to 54, in addition to being the school secretary, he taught himself through night school and basically got a geography degree and qualified himself to become a teacher. And he worked his way up through the school to become the second master. And Maurice and George were a real double act, for example, appearing in the Gentaculum in various sketches. And he retired after 40 years at the school. Incredible service. Both his sons attended the school. But a bit like Richard Perham, I think, it's an incredible story of social mobility there, and the way that the school was a conduit for that. So George was a remarkable guy. I always found him a lovely, warm and gentle soul. I'm aware that lots of people at the school at the time were absolutely terrified of him. And again, it shows this very different perspective. Before I get to person number 8, I just want to have a quick word about Martin Pavey. If you look at the portraits that are currently in the hall, you'll notice that they don't quite match up with the list of heads. Martin Pavey was head 1988 to 91, a short period of time, and I think that's why there's no portrait. But interestingly, his son, Rob Pavey, was the deputy head at Kensington Aldridge Academy. So when that school was evacuated from the Grenfell Tower fire, actually Rob came to the school, and it was really nice to be able to sort of reunite with him. And he had very fond memories, and I know his father did too. So it's good that that had a happy ending. But person number 8, particularly because I've got 5 minutes left, person number 8 is Colin Diggory, grammar school educated, but University of Durham, but again, a grammar school boy, and indeed taught at Manchester Grammar as well. He was the deputy head at the school, and when Pavey left, became head in 91 to 2002. And again, Colin faced some challenges, not least the abolition of the assisted places scheme, and quite what that did to the social diversity of the school. That was a severe challenge, and he did what needed to be done to keep the school going, quite frankly. But the other thing he did, which if you talk to Colin, was very controversial at the time, was he was the first person with the governors to moot co-education. And it was a very controversial move at the time. I've spoken to Colin about this, and he actually received death threats about it, which is very alarming. Not all of them from the headmistress of Godolphin and Latymer, but it was a really bold move, a really visionary move, and a very Latymer move. And it's hard to imagine that the school ever wasn't co-ed. It's just worked so well, and it's just a very us thing to do. But it was controversial, it was bold, and again, Colin, I think, deserves his sort of credit for initiating that with the governors at sixth form level initially, and we're coming on to how the school became fully co-ed shortly. But I think Colin played an important role in that, which it's important to recognise. And that brings me to person number 9, Peter Winter, and again, I hope Peter's here this evening. Scholarship boy at Trinity Croydon, and then Oxford educated, finally, 2002 to 2012. And again, I think Peter's contribution is very significant to the school. The implementation of full co-education, which he'd done at King Edward's Bath and brought to Latymer from 2004, and very, very successfully, raising academic standards, and in particular the behaviour and culture of the school. And I know Peter and I have talked about this. When I was growing up in Hammersmith in the 80s, Latymer was regarded as quite a rough school, actually. And I say that as somebody who went to a school where the reason I had a year of Greek is that our Spanish teacher had been shot by a local school, but we thought Latymer was rough. So well done to Peter for getting stuck into that. Clearly a transformational building programme, and buildings and facilities have kind of been a running theme throughout the school. But I think the school looks incredible now, and hats off to Peter and Alex Hurst for making that so. And of course, the creation of the Development Office and the beginning of the means-tested scholarship programme, and that sort of ability to try and get back to the kind of school that we used to be. So many things. And on a personal note, an incredibly kind and generous induction for me coming in as the new head. So again, very important, I think, to acknowledge Peter's contribution to the school. And that sort of brings us up to the present day and person number 10. And person number 10 is where we get some audience participation, perhaps in questions, because I'm interested in your thoughts about who I've missed out. Is it a teacher? Is it a governor? I mean, I think there's a strong case for John Bullock, for example, former pupil of the school, chairman of governors, whose sound financial management, again, pretty much saved the school in difficult times. Or is there a pupil or a former pupil or alumnus that I've missed out? So as I finish, and thank you for your attention, and I'm bang on time, which is a first, I'd be really interested in your thoughts about who should be number 10 there. Is there anyone you can think of, a teacher, a governor, an alum, a pupil, anyone else connected with the school that you feel has been overlooked? Because we're writing a new history of the school and we can put that right. So I'm going to stop sharing this. Very good. And I'm back in the room. And I think Joe is in charge of the chat. So I'm going to stop talking. I might even mute, and then Joe's going to tell me what happens next.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you, David. We have a couple of comments. Steve Johnson was saying, "Dear Fred, many tears were shed when he retired." And also big staff revulsion against Robert Orme. Oh, Robert Orme's been suggested, sorry, maybe as number 10. Would anybody like to unmute and ask a question or pop it in the chat?
I think Alan Rickman's a good shout. Again, exemplifies so many of those things we were talking about.
Here we go. Okay.
Yeah, and Steve, you're right. I've heard that from a lot of people about Mr. and Mrs. Wiggins, actually. I mean, just coming back to Robert Orme, I think the thing that he can claim, because he used to teach half of year 7 and the other half of year 8, he's virtually the only member of staff over 47 years who can legitimately claim to have taught every pupil in the school. And I think that's pretty massive. Bill, yeah, Tony, absolutely. And interestingly, I hope David Uren's here this evening as well. One of the current weaknesses, I think, of the existing history of the school is there's not enough on music. There's a brief mention of Raphael Volfish in 1969, but there's not enough about the musical life of the school. So again, that's something we really hope to put right.
Oh, a few more questions popping in.
Yeah, I mean, the WAC, that's, I mean, again, interesting talking to, former pupils about their experience of discipline at the school. And again, I mentioned challenges. The generation who came back from the war, both wars actually, that did leave them changed. And I've heard some difficult stories about, the demons that the masters brought back with them and the extent to which that affected their relationship with the boys. So I think that's absolutely right. And certainly Hugh Grant, again, a bit like Mel Smith, without those people, the bursary program, wouldn't really have got going in the way that it did. And the leadership he showed and continues to show is absolutely fantastic.
Would anyone else like to unmute themselves and ask a question?
Could I ask a question? Peter Winter here.
Hello, Peter.
Hi. David, really enjoyed your talk. I would particularly like to support your notion that John Bullock might be considered here. I worked with John. I was appointed as head when he was chairman of governors. And I know from talking to people like Alex Hurst in the years before I came, how important John's contribution was in keeping Latymer above water, as it were. There were really difficult days in the early 90s when it was difficult to get enough boys to come to the school. And there were severe financial issues. And John, with his financial and accounting expertise, was crucial in getting the school up and onto an even keel. So he has my vote.
I think that's very well said, and it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, to think how far we've come in a short space of time. I mean, looking at the numbers now, I think people wouldn't imagine that there was ever a time that was true. But you're right, it wasn't that long ago at all. No, I think that's absolutely right. So I think there's a question about the Duke's Meadows opportunity. So this is to do with a partnership opportunity with Hounslow and some local sports clubs to take a lease on some land that's 4 times the size of Wood Lane, to complement our provision there, and bring all of a lot of the sport into one place for boys and girls. Wood Lane is incredible, particularly for football and rugby, but we also need space for girls hockey, netball, and also we've got so many teams now. And this is an opportunity to benefit our students and also benefit the local community. And the big advantage it has, unlike Wood Lane, is we can get there a lot more quickly. So the carbon footprint's reduced, the costs are reduced, and actually get more games time for going there. So it will be alongside, it will sit alongside Wood Lane, and together they should give us all the space we need. And that would cheer Ken Sutcliffe up, because he was pointing that out back in 1961. Jim, I completely agree about Chris Hammond. Absolutely right. Although I don't think he's forgiven Hugh for getting his name wrong. But the impression was spot on.
Graham, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
I mean, it's an interesting point, Graham, you make about the chemistry teaching. And again, at different sort of phases in the school, there have been sort of real sort of pockets of excellence. I mean, science has been strong, you know, for a long time. And, you know, people like Abbott in physics, for example, but the chemistry teaching has always been strong. Languages was very strong in the 40s, and people like Grauberg, but also Jerry Roberts. And then, you know, in the 60s and 70s, the humanities, the English and history were very, very strong again, to the extent that, and Peter will know more about this than I do, there was almost a sense, you know, in sort of 2011 with the construction of the science building, that we needed to kind of regain ground on science because, you know, the humanities, the English and the history were so dominant. So that's interesting.
I thank you for your talk. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
I was at the school from 55 to 62, and one of the things I loved about chemistry was that the milk break in the morning, because the teachers would leave the labs and then we could do our private experiments, which was actually great fun, and we did all sorts of things we shouldn't really do, but that gave me a love of the subject. And the making gases and exploding them and all sorts of stuff like that really attracted me to chemistry, and that stayed with me, which is why I studied it in the end. But I think the biggest thing the school gave me, and I'm sure it did to a lot of people of my generation, was self-belief and confidence. It was, and I think Latymer still does that, and your emphasis on social mobility, because like you, I was the first person from my family to ever go to a school like Latymer, get a university education. And it's, I've always been forever grateful to Latymer for that opportunity. So thank you, Latymer.
Yeah.
Jerry, have you got a question?
Yeah, thanks very much. I really enjoyed that, by the way. Thank you very much. I joined during Maurice Isaac's time, and he was terrifying, but in a sort of presence way, if you see what I mean. And without meaning to put Martin Pavey down, there was a difficult couple of years, which I think didn't work just generally. But that's where I think Colin Diggory was really important. He brought morale back to the school. And not only did he do that with the staff, I think, but also the pupils. But also, I wasn't a maths person by any means, but friends who did maths A-level, he actually went in and saved them in their exams. You know, he friends of mine say without him coming in to teach them maths, not only was he a really good headmaster for the transition, he actually really saved a lot of my friends from failing their maths. So I think Colin Diggory's quite a really important guy when he took over to the school.
Yeah, I think that's well said. I mean, it was a tricky time. He really steadied the ship, unenviable position to be in. But I've heard that from other people as well, particularly about the math teaching as well.
Brilliant. Any further questions?
I'd love to ask a question.
Lovely. Please do.
Hi, John. It's Maria. So first of all, really enjoyed the presentation. I'm fascinated by the history of the school, and being Greek myself, it's always great to understand fully history, and especially as I bring my daughter now to school. One thought I was having as I was listening in is, how many years do you think it might take the school to have a headmistress?
Great question. And actually, well, so there's so much to say about that. So firstly, we've got a female Doctor Who, and if heads are like Doctor Who, then you know, a female head can't be that far away. It's a question I got asked at an open day a few years ago by a young lady who looked at the board of headmasters and said, well, they're all men. You're meant to be a co-ed school. What's that about? So I don't think it will be very far away at all. Probably within the next 100 years, because I won't be retiring for a good 100. but as and when that time comes, because I've got infinite regeneration capability. But you know, on the sad day in 100 years' time, when I choose to retire, it wouldn't surprise me at all. And if you look at other schools, there's a definite movement in that direction. You know, Alain's have got their first female head. St Paul's boys have got the first female High Master. And rightly so. That's exactly as it should be. Yeah, I would be amazed if one of my successors isn't a woman, and I'd be really disappointed as well.
Thank you.
Bill.
Great. Well, greetings from Ireland, and thank you, David and Amanda, for an amazing evening. We were going to hop on for 15 minutes, and we stayed to the end. It was so riveting. David, Judy and I were thinking that in all the heads that you've described, they faced enormous challenges and solved them, and that's why you've picked the ones you picked. And we have great confidence in you, but what do you think are the biggest challenges you face over the next couple of years?
Great question. I think they're not unique to us. I think the two big ones are sustainability and what we do about net zero, and making sure that our diversity and inclusion covers all the bases. And I've mentioned, for example, there are ways in which the history of the school is deficient in that respect. So I think there's more work to do on diversity and inclusion, and I definitely think there's a lot of really careful thinking, long-range thinking about sustainability, and not in a sort of tick box way and sort of buying a forest somewhere, but in a genuine, holistic way. So I would say those are the two biggies. And interestingly, from the student perspective, those are their top two priorities. So if I tell you, when we reviewed the uniform, the number one thing that the students were interested in was the environmental impact of the uniform, both in terms of manufacture, distance travel, that sort of thing. So from the students' perspective, those two issues are really close to their heart.
Thank you, David. Do you think that there are, do you think that there's an opportunity to invite guest speakers onto the campus, from various points of view, who could discuss the very issues that you're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. We're so lucky with the Latymer network, both in terms of alumni and parents, and the pupils are really privileged in terms of the access they get and the ability to interrogate, incredible people. But I think there's definitely more that we can do on that. And the other thing that works really well in the Latymer context is having a panel, because you want a variety of opinions. You don't, and actually, let's be honest, some of these issues are quite vexed, and there isn't one simple answer or one single truth. And I think exposing people to the complexity of the debate would be excellent.
Thanks very much.
Quick question from Andy. Would you like to unmute yourself, Andy? Oops, sorry, just going to unmute you. No, just, are you able to, there we are, lovely.
Yeah, it's actually Rosie. It's on his laptop, but it's me.
Yeah.
So you thank you very much for the talk. It was fantastic to know a little bit more about Latymer. And you said regarding the heads, each one you mentioned had real difficulties and challenges. Which one do you think, in your term, would be your biggest challenge? Would that be the sustainability you're just talking right now, or do you see something ahead, things like COVID, or I don't know?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? If you'd asked me this time last year, then a global pandemic certainly wouldn't have been on the list. But I think that's the nature of leadership, isn't it? You've got to get on with it and make the right decisions and lead people through and support them, whatever comes. And sometimes stuff just comes out of the blue, and you've got to sort of deal with it in the way that those heads who had to deal with the impact and aftermath of the wars, for example, or the political threats and challenges. Again, if you'd asked me last year, I would have said Labour government was the thing that was keeping me up at night, rather than COVID-19. So I think you never know what's around the corner is the answer. But I do think, back to the sustainability point, the risk is that we're so understandably focused on this year or particular events, and that long-term clock is ticking and ticking and ticking, and the window to do anything about it is shrinking. So that's a worry for me, I think, because there's other stuff urgent day-to-day stuff that gets in the way. And also those things are quite difficult to tackle unilaterally. They require sort of global collaboration. And let's be honest, global collaboration is in quite short supply right now.
Yes,
because
yes,
most countries have their own difficulties. And again, I suppose what I find inspiring about someone like Wilkinson is that notion of looking, you know, having, he said, you know, we must enlarge our vision of what it means to be European. And we must understand that the things that unite us are greater than the differences that separate us. And I think, you know, we need that kind of thinking. And I'm sorry to say, as I look around the world, I don't see that kind of thinking in much sort of political leadership. I do see that kind of thinking among young people, and the people who give me real optimism and hope for the future are the young people, both in school and recent leavers. They're incredible, and you know, when they're running the world, I'm going to be a happy guy.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rosie. Thank you, David. How wonderful to hear of 10 people who exemplify different aspects of the school's ethos and history. And I'm not surprised Latymer offers such a diverse and dynamic environment with such great influences over the years. Truly inspiring, David. Thank you very much. And if, like me, you've been left feeling inspired, then why not join us on Thursday lunchtime from 1 till 2, when Mark Wallace, Head of Economics, will be talking about myth, legend and legacy of Margaret Thatcher in a lunchtime lecture called Thatcher, the Milk Snatcher, or Saviour of the Nation. If you would like to register to join this event, please copy the link from the chat facility now. I've also included a link to our forthcoming events programme, the donations page, and a link to the video library where you'll find recordings from all the summer events to enjoy at your leisure. Sadly, that brings us to the end of this evening, but thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, David, again for sharing your incredible timeline of Latymer, and I hope we'll see you all again very soon. Good night.